casual. So, hi, I'm Edwin Rutsch, Director of the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy, and this is Dialogs on Building a Culture of Empathy. And today I'm pleased to be here with Arthur. How do you pronounce your last name again?
Ciaramicoli.
Ciaramicoli. Thank you. That's quite a name there. So, yeah, so you're a licensed clinical psychologist, and you've been treating clients for 35 years. I see here in your bio, and you're a member of the American Psychological Association, as well as the Massachusetts Psychological Association, and you're on the medical school and on the faculty, and lecturer at the American Cancer Society. And also in 2000, you came out with this book, The Power of Empathy, and a practical guide for creating intimacy, self-understanding, and lasting love. So you've been working on the theme of empathy for some time now. And your recent book, which is why we're chatting here, is to talk about this book, The Stress Solution, Using Empathy in Cognitive Behavioral Therapy to Reduce Anxiety and Develop Resilience. And is there more by way of introduction you'd like to add? Oh, in your website, I can maybe just get that out of the way right away, balanceyoursuccess.com, and people can find out more about you at this website. So is there more by way of introduction that you'd like to add?
No, that's great.
Okay. So can you tell me about how did you get interested in empathy to begin with? You've been working on this at least, 20 years or longer, or how did you get started with the theme of empathy?
Well, I think I did not feel particularly listened to early on in my life. And I tell a story in The Power of Empathy about a guidance counselor who told me when I was a senior in high school that I was not college material, and that he gave me 5 brochures, the Army, Navy, Coast Guard, Marines, and I forgot the Army, I guess. And so it was from that helping people, not really listening very attentively. And I think I had experienced that in my life in general. So I had read the work of Heinz Kohut many years ago when I was studying at a psychoanalytic institute in the early 70s. And he certainly placed a great emphasis on empathy. And then I was trying to take it and make it more interpersonal and put it into action and actually develop programs where people could learn how to use it. Because I think this capacity for empathy that we're born with, if it's not used, it atrophies like an unused muscle. And I believe that people can learn how to use empathy. I think, our daughter is a kindergarten teacher, and she says when you watch children in a playground at that age, even though they're from different cultures and different backgrounds, and boys even have as much empathy as girls, but as they age, as they're in the 3rd or 4th grade, she can see a difference. And of course, that's because of who they're exposed to and what they're learning from being at home, the biases, the conditioning, and so forth. And in a sense, they start to unlearn what was naturally there. So it's a sense of uncovering what has been there all along. I mean, we know that we have mirror neurons. We know we have the capacity to develop empathy. Some people, I've been told many people don't have the empathy gene, but then when they come into my groups, after a period of time, you see that they're unleashing it. They're uncovering it. So a lot of what I focus on is not finding out what's wrong with you, but uncover what's been right with you all along.
So what I'm hearing there is that growing up, you didn't feel heard yourself. And so when you started feeling heard, started having someone direct empathy towards you, I imagine it felt really good. And maybe you're saying, hey, I want more of this. And is that kind of?
Yes, yes. When I did a postgraduate year of high school, believe it or not, and I was at Bridgeton Academy in Maine, which was mainly a prep school for boys who were not particularly oriented academically, but were athletes, and they would help these young men learn how to study. And I was interviewed with my dad, actually my guidance counselor, when the principal came to our high school in Massachusetts. This was a school in Maine. They didn't even call me to go to the interview because they didn't think that I was someone who would benefit from this. So my dad was upset by that. He drove me up to Maine, 4 hours away, and we sat down with Mr. Goldsmith, who I included in The Power of Empathy. And after 20 minutes of listening to my dad tell him about me, he said, Mr. Ciaramicoli, you need to leave the room. And he said to me, do you really want to come here? And I said, no. He said, why don't you want to come here? And I said, well, my guidance counselor told me I'm not college material. I don't read a lot. I'm not very academically oriented. I really think it's a mistake, and I don't want to hurt my dad's feelings, but I don't want to come here and just flunk out, you know? And he said, so you don't read anything? And I said, not really. He said, well, you're a football player, aren't you? And I said, yes. And he said, well, what do you read anything about football? And I said, yeah, I read the sports page. I read Sports Illustrated. Then he started asking me questions about what was the average yard per carry for Jimmy Brown of the Cleveland Browns, and I knew the answer. And what was the score of the last championship game? And I knew the score. And he said, what was the passing yardage of Y.A. Tittle? And I knew the exact percentage of his passing yardage and so forth, and how many yards. And he goes, well, I guess you read something. Evidently, they haven't gathered your interest. He said, I think you do comprehend and you can read. So if you come here, we'll teach you how to read other things. You see, that was my first experience of someone seeing beyond the surface.
Oh, wow. Mm-hmm.
You know, my guidance counselor saw the surface, the scorecard, and said, you're not college material. Mr. Goldsmith, this very wise headmaster at this prep school, saw beyond that. And he looked into to see, what did I comprehend? What did I like to learn? And I obviously was learning where I thought was the only place I could learn, which was in the world of athletics. But he was able to uncover something. And he raised my spirits. And in that moment, we had an empathic interchange. And that was the beginning.
Oh, wow. And then I imagine that it affected your whole life, your whole trajectory of your life, absolutely. Just being heard deeply like that, understood.
Well, I was there in 1966, 65, 66. So in the year 2000, I wrote about him. So that's how important it was to me, that moment of unleashing potential. And then that made me very interested in doing the same. Seeing beyond. Whenever I hear a young person say they're stupid or they're unattractive or they can't make the debate team or they can't get a spot on a play, I want to examine the facts, because that's what empathy is. It's very fact-oriented. It's very objective. And we all grow up with biases about ourselves and others, and that's where I think a lot of prejudice comes into play. And when we're biased, when we're prejudiced, we release stress. We experience stress. When we have stress, we release cortisol, as you know, which is the stress hormone that causes inflammation, negative thinking, depression. It kills neurons in the memory center of the brain. So it has many negative effects. And I don't think people always realize that when we're not feeling comfortable, when we begin to feel stressed, our camera lens, our empathic camera lens, goes from a wide lens camera to a very narrow camera. And we know when we're stressed and we release cortisol, empathy is really reduced substantially. And I think that's what contributes to prejudice, which is very important to me. And that's why I wrote a chapter on prejudice. And you know what's happening recently in our country, it's extremely disturbing, obviously. Because of the prejudice rates have gone up, empathy has gone down, trust has gone down. Americans have fewer friends than they've had in the last 15 years. So we're in a troubling place in our society. And I think empathy is the answer to slow down and begin to understand other people that initially look different than us. But when we get beyond the surface and into the heart and souls of other people, we realize we're all more alike than not alike.
Well, that's the basic framework of your book. Oh, getting a little bit of echo. Let's see, hopefully maybe I'll talk softer. There's the main part of your book, or it's basically framed around, there's stress, anxiety, fear, and these emotions that are based on cortisol or generate cortisol in the body, and that this can be transformed through empathy into trust, openness, security, resilience, and that's based on the hormone oxytocin, or neuropeptide, I believe it is. So that's the basic framework of the book, going through this transformation. Is that kind of correct? That's and you're really making this, that's the core case here.
Yes, I'm making the core case that that when we combine empathy with cognitive behavioral therapy, which is basically focused on distorted thinking, when we slow down and realize, when we slow down and use the thinking brain rather than the emotional part of the brain, we can see more of where our biases are. And when we give and receive empathy, we can learn about our biases and unlearn some of the myths that we've learned early in life. You know, I always say that early in life, we write a novel about ourselves. Essentially, we learn about ourselves through the mirrors we look into of our parents, our teachers, our coaches, our drama teachers, whoever. But if they're biased, we learn biased things about ourselves. It's sort of like looking in a circus mirror. Our job as adults is to slow down, to give and receive empathy so that we find out who we truly are. And when we do that, I mean, the most fascinating thing to me is that when we have an empathic interchange, we release oxytocin, which is this near miracle neurotransmitter that allows, I mean, it reduces inflammation, it makes us live longer, it makes us feel more secure and trusting of each other so that we can open up and be vulnerable and closer to each other. So we make deeper connections. But we can produce this chemical just by the way we interact with each other, when we see beyond the surface of each other. And interestingly, I think it's one of the most critical things regarding weight gain, because we have a tremendous problem with obesity with children and adults in our country, that when we have excess cortisol in our system, it throws off the blood sugar ratio, which makes us desire sugary substances. And it also increases fat cells. And it's probably one of the key pieces to weight gain that isn't discussed very much, I think, in weight programs.
Well, you're talking about the negative effects of cortisol and stress and anxiety, and I've put together a list of the negative, the problems with stress. You say 66% of doctors' visits are related to stress. 50% of people wake up at night troubled. I do that too, so I can identify with that. Anxiety. Decrease in your immune system. So your immune system is being affected. There's heightened health, disease, and diabetes. There's higher cancer rates, I guess, as cortisol is in your body, that causes more inflammation and makes you more susceptible and decreases your immune system. So it's going to make you more susceptible to cancer. You have faster aging because it wears on you. And you mentioned lower quality of life, that if you're feeling the stress, there's more worried, lower performance, lack of judgment. Your memory is affected. So if you have all that stress, you're kind of having more difficulty remembering. And then you can also not learn as well. So if you're in a school environment and you're trying to learn, that's going to block that. And then there's other, the weight gain, which you mentioned, and I think you even had dementia. So you lay out the whole negative effects of the anxiety and stress and effects of cortisol.
Yes. Yes. I mean, 75% of visits, Edwin, to primary care physicians in the year 2015 were due to stress.
Wow, it's going up then.
Amazing, 75%. I mean, it's an amazing statistic. And as you say, people are waking up at night due to stress. And people are saying that they experience it on a daily basis. So what is the answer in our fast-paced society? To slow down. The fear, and I talk about performance addiction, as you know in the book, the fear of people who are addicted to performing and believe that achievement is the only way to gain love and respect and to achieve along with perfecting their appearance. They're afraid to slow down. They're afraid if they slow down, they'll lose their edge. They're afraid that somebody else will get ahead. And they're always comparing and contrasting themselves to other people. And they do the same with their spouses, their significant other, and unfortunately their kids. So these kids grow up in a very stressed environment where they're always expected to achieve at very high levels or there's something wrong with them. So we're teaching children that it's not about who you are, it's about what you do that will gain love and respect in life. That who you are, the character, the character, your own character, whether you're honest, whether you have integrity, whether you care about other people, whether you're giving, that takes a back seat to achievement and appearance. And it's a tremendous mistake because all performance addicts are unhappy. You ask them, is it working for you? You got a bigger house, you got a nicer car, your 401k is going up, but you can't sleep at night. And your relationships are poor. You can't stay still long enough to form a good relationship because you can't be present. So how is this making you happy? It's making you miserable.
There's just a story came to mind as you were saying that in terms of performance anxiety, that there was a group of students, high school students, that were taking a class, taking classes at Stanford. I think it was online. And I did an empathy circle with them online, like, you know, doing empathic listening, showing them how to do empathic listening. And I was shocked at the level of stress they were going in. This is like super high achievers. And they all did a check-in. And the first thing they talked about, I mean, it was like, I was like so shocked at the level of stress. They were saying, oh, I'm having so much stress. I'm just feeling so, you know, it was totally amazing to me. I didn't, you know, when I grew up, it was like I was out there riding my bicycle, you know, out in the fields and stuff. And just to hear the level of stress was just, I mean, it was like heartbreaking in a sense.
I think it is heartbreaking, Edwin, because I think these are good young people, and the adults that are training them to be this way are often very good people too. But they're so afraid that their kids aren't going to get ahead because they bought into this belief that the way to succeed in life, personally and professionally, is to achieve and to gain status and image, and also to perfect the way you look. And it's such tremendous pressure that you can't relax. You can't have fun. So I talk about in the book image love, because performance addicts, I think, they form relationships based on images. So they don't really love another person. They're loving the way another person looks. You know, I had a recent example where a couple was transferred from California, where you are, and this fellow was a CFO, and he had lost his job, very high-level job, making a lot of money. And he married this younger woman who used to be in meetings with him. You know, she was an intern, and then she was hired there, so she was very impressed by his status. So they moved to Massachusetts because he had an opportunity for a job. It fell through. Long story short, she said to me in the fifth couple session, she said, I don't feel the same way about him anymore. I said, well, how come? She goes, well, I used to look at him in his suits, in his beautiful ties and shirts, and he'd stand up in meetings and speak. And now I come home and he's in sweatpants looking for jobs on the internet. And I said, is he not the same person? She says, well, it just doesn't feel the same to me. See, that's what image love is. Did she love him for who he is? He's a nice guy. There's nothing wrong. In the day, in the winter, he's in sweatpants in Massachusetts looking for a job on the internet. Is he supposed to have a tie on? I mean, he was just out of work for a while. But is he going to get into that higher level, you know, $400,000, $500,000? I don't know. He's in his mid-50s. She's a young woman in her early 30s. She was impressed with a status symbol, not a person. That's not love. It's what I call image love. And it's very disheartening for both of them. But her next love object is going to be the same, unless she unlearns that. I mean, she comes from a very hard driving family where everybody is very educated, very affluent. And I asked her about her parents. Are they happy? My parents have never been happy. Do we see the connection here? Well, because they're very driven too. So once you believe it, once you take on this myth, you think you can perfect your way into happiness, and empathy goes out the window.
So instead of trying to perfect your way into happiness, we can empathize our way into happiness, which is feeling into each other's real life, truthful experience, and sort of like healing each other through empathy, sharing our stresses, our anxieties, our fears, and transforming those into real life, real connection. And
yes, it's the real connections that sustain us, because they produce those good chemicals. We feel safe. We can open up to each other. And then we're not in image relationships. We're in real relationships, because you know me and I know you. Plus, we're producing oxytocin, because just in this interaction right now, if I feel understood by you and you feel understood by me, we're changing our brain chemistry. It's like we have a remote control in our hands. Our nervous systems talk to each other. So we have a profound impact on each other. The irony is, a lot of people in the business world, in the corporate world, they'll say, oh, empathy is a soft skill. I don't need empathy. Stephen Covey said many years ago, when he was asked, what's the most important ingredient to be successful in the corporate world? He said one word: empathy. He said, how can you work with customers if you don't understand them? If you don't understand what they want? How can you even design products that the public is going to want if you don't understand the public? Harvard Business Review, they did a study on what was the most successful ingredients for success for their MBA graduates. It was people who made people, executives who made people feel heard and made them feel understood, both the heart of empathy.
So then that brings us to, how do we go about kind of doing, fostering, nurturing that empathy? Like, what are the best approaches and tools or processes or attitudes or mindsets that you found for doing that, for the actual nuts and bolts of practical empathy building practice, maybe?
The first thing I think of always, and I try to teach myself this on a daily basis, is 2 words: slow down. It sounds simple, but slow down. Everybody's moving, not everybody, but most of us are moving too fast. Slow down. When you educate people to the fact when you slow down, you produce calming neurochemicals that allow you to be more focused, more creative, and more intelligent. If you move fast, you produce cortisol. As you said earlier, it limits your capacity to be empathic, and empathy allows you to see all the variables in the situation. It's been proven that kids who have empathy do better on test scores. Why? Because when they're reading a story and they have to comprehend and pick out the answers to certain questions, they see the whole picture. They're not just memorizing, they get the overall structure. So it's important just to be able to say to yourself, am I moving too fast? Am I listening? Am I rehearsing what I'm going to say while you're talking? Well, one of my patients says to her husband, she says, Tom, you're always reloading. Meaning that when she's speaking, he's like this, you know, he can't wait to get in and he's not really listening. And I have to often ask him, what did Marie say? I don't know, something about this weekend? Well, what about this week? He gets a little piece of it because he's so anxious to talk, as if you keep talking, somehow that's going to gain you the respect of other people. I can guarantee you one thing after doing this for many years. If you know how to listen empathically, you will always have friends. Human beings take to it like a honey to bee. No human being can resist being understood. We all have an inherent desire to be understood. If you know how to listen from that empathic position, you know, what some people have called holy listening, the listening a person's soul into a position of disclosure and discovery. It's a profound experience. Most people have not even experienced it. So when you provide it, and when you can give and receive empathy, you're in relationships that sustain us. They make us feel younger. They give us more energy, and we perform on higher levels. So when corporate people start to understand, if you want to continue to perform on a high level for the right reasons and not burn out, you need to practice the discipline of empathy.
Okay, so I'm hearing two kind of processes there for the actually nurturing of the empathy. One is to slow down, and which sounds like could be maybe like mindfulness practices. That's very much geared to slowing down. And then the other practice would be empathic listening, learning how to listen empathically, and maybe practice that.
And the key to empathic listening is to ask open-ended questions, not closed-end questions. You know, most questions are statements. It's like when a young person comes home for a date and the mother says to the young girl, did you really like him? With that tone. Well, what she's saying is, I didn't like him. That's a closed-ended question. It creates resistance and defensiveness. That young person's not going to want to talk about it. I don't want to talk about it, Mom, I'm going to bed. If you say, how did your date go? That's an open-ended question. You're opening the door to a person telling you about their experience. If you ask closed-end questions, one is you don't have the courage to make a statement, and secondly, you're making a statement assuming that what you think and what you believe, the other person should think and believe as well. So asking open-ended questions is very important. The third piece is learning from the past, and that's where giving and receiving empathy and practicing accurate perceiving is very important, because we have to know what our biases were from the past. We have to rewrite the novel we wrote early in life and make it a nonfiction story. You might have grown up thinking you're not smart, or you're not creative, or you're not athletic, or you don't have a good singing voice, or whatever. But you have to ask yourself today, and we cannot do this alone because we're all too subjective. We have to rewrite the story to find out who we are. That's why I have a chapter in the book that says, who am I? You know, today, find out who you are. Look into the mirrors of people that you consider trustworthy and objective, who have the courage to tell you the truth about yourself. You know, good friends give us what we need, not what we want. You know, if you have a friend who looks extremely tired, or you go to dinner with them and they generally don't drink and they have 3 beers and 2 shots of whiskeys, instead of sitting there passively, I would say to you, Edwin, you don't even drink. What's going on? Can you tell me what's going on? Well, what do you mean? Well, you're drinking excessively. It's out of character for you. Can you let me know what's going on? Not presuming, not coming in and saying, hey, you know, what the hell is wrong with you drinking like that? No, not accusations, not judgments. It's non-judgmental relating. I have the courage to ask you. I'm not going to just sit there passively and then call up a friend and tell him about you. I'm going to have the courage to tactfully relate to you and let you know that it looks like something's wrong.
Mm-hmm. So the first part I was hearing there, it sounds like we've maybe through our life we've created these judgments, or these self-judgments, and that you're saying go back to those past judgments and really empathize or feel into those and sort of undo those and get to the actual truth underneath. Am I kind of getting the essence of that strategy? I mean, that's the approach, is, you know, and I think that's what you're doing in your groups. I'd like to hear more about, you know, how your groups are structured, that you facilitate. So they're kind of like empathy building groups, I imagine. And so you're using cognitive behavioral therapy to go back into those judgments and kind of surface and get under the surface of those judgments and kind of to a deeper truth is kind of how I'm kind of hearing that. Is that kind of?
Yes, I think that's very well said, and I think that's exactly the process. The cognitive behavioral therapy piece, I add empathy to it to call it empathic cognitive behavioral therapy, because cognitive behavioral therapy just focuses on the present. But we need to know where our distortions come from so we can unlearn them. So I use the cognitive behavioral therapy piece because they focus a lot on particular kinds of ways that we misperceive. For instance, generalizations, or minimizing, or black and white thinking, or catastrophizing, or minimizing. So in the beginning of the book, there's a glossary, a list of the typical ways that people distort reality about themselves and others. And once you know what yours are, what your biases are, we can unlearn them. And it's not, again, it's not so much focusing on what's wrong with you, it's going back to that early time in life where we perceived more purely. Little children perceive purely. We're taught to not perceive purely. And then we grow up with these distortions. I wrote a chapter about prejudice because, as I mentioned earlier, I'm so concerned about it in our society. And very good people making very prejudicial statements. For instance, one of my clients, who is a good person, a CEO, very well educated, said to me, he heard a dog barking. Because my home office had windows open, there was a dog barking next door. And he said, oh, just reminds me when I was growing up, you know, dogs don't like black people. I said, dogs don't like black people? He goes, yeah, it's something about the smell, I think. I said, well, how did you learn this? He said, well, when I grew up, there was a black family on the corner. It was the only black family. And I remember my mother saying that black dogs don't like black people. And we had 2 dogs. I said, did you ever take the dogs to the black family and actually introduce the dogs to the family? He said, no, now you're making me feel silly. I said, I'm not trying to make you feel silly. I'm just trying to examine the truth. Your mother told you that dogs don't like the black uncle who has 2 dogs, and they love him, and our dogs love him. In fact, he's kind of like, we call him the dog whisperer because they take to him so easily. He loves animals. And he said, well, what are you saying? And I said, from what you're telling me, your belief that you grew up with. And I think it's an excellent example of what prejudice does. You heard this as a young boy, and it got encoded in the deeper part of your brain, the emotional part of your brain. And as a 52-year-old adult, you still believe it. But you've never actually been with a black person with a dog. And he said, yeah, you're right, I feel silly. I said, well, you know, I'm not trying to make you feel silly. We're trying to unlearn prejudicial perceptions so that you can feel closer to certain people. Because if you're with a dog and a black person walks down the street, you're going to feel uncomfortable when you don't need to.
So when you do your groups, you mentioned doing groups. Is that correct in your book? And I was wondering, what does a group look like when you, like, how many people come to? How does a group process work? Like, kind of from the beginning, middle, and end.
Well, I have 3 groups, Edwin, because they're different ages. They've all been ongoing for over 25 years. Obviously not the same people, but one is from early 20s to 30, then the second one is from about 35 to 45, and the third one is from about 50 to mid-70s. So they're 3 different life cycles, essentially. There's 10 people in each group, and it's fairly unstructured. I ask people when we start anything left over from last week, because I'm looking to see, for instance, interesting, one of the clients said, well, last week Roy was frowning at me when I was talking, and I think, Roy, you were probably angry with me. And I said, Roy, do you remember when Susan was talking, what were you experiencing? He goes, I had a terrible migraine last week. That's why I was probably frowning. I wasn't angry. See, the group is about correcting misperceptions. Now, she has a father who's an angry man. She grew up in an angry household where he would have these outbursts, and she never knew when it would happen. So there's an edge that you live with in the family. So she comes into this group, and this man is sitting there, and he's frowning. So immediately she's associating that frown with anger. He had a migraine. So now it seems like a small thing, but now she's beginning to learn that expression, you're generalizing. There's where the cognitive distortion is, and we see many examples of this. I had a woman not long ago come in. I added her because we had somebody end, and I added her, and one of the fellas asked her, what brings you here? And she said, well, I'm going through a divorce, and I met with Dr. C, and we thought it would be helpful for me to learn more about how I relate to other people. And one of the women said, oh, I'm telling you, I went through a divorce 2 years ago. You got to get a hard-nosed attorney. I know a guy in Boston. He's exactly who you need. And another guy jumped in. He goes, I know you can get taken to the cleaners. You got to get somebody. And then one of the other guys was going like this. He was just nodding. And I said, Frank, what? You're nodding. He said, we're all over Mary telling her what to do. She needs a hard-nosed attorney. We haven't even asked her what this whole divorce experience is like. And so I said, well, why don't you ask her? And he did. And she said, you know, my husband and I was pregnant when I was a senior in high school. I'm 48 years old. We got married. We were never really in love, although we always respected and liked each other. And we raised our daughter, and she's very successful today, happily married, as a school teacher, has a child. But we were never in love. And we both want to see if we can have that experience in life. My husband is a very good person. I don't hate him. I don't need a hard-nosed attorney. We're both using a mediator. It's going to cost us $2,800 to get divorced. And everything's fine. Now, both of those people were using sympathy who jumped in. You know, sympathy jumps in to console based on I'm identifying that my experience is your experience. So the woman and the man who went through difficult divorces automatically assumed that she was having the same experience as they. That's empathy. You jump in impulsively to try to help. The fellow who was nodding his head was displaying empathy because he was saying, I don't know the facts. What are the facts? Then the new person tells the facts, and we find out she doesn't need a hard-nosed attorney at all. Doesn't hate her husband. She's not worried about him doing anything unethical. It's a totally different situation. Empathy slows down the process. Empathy asks the open-ended question, like this fella asked, what is the nature of your divorce? He didn't conclude anything. Interestingly, he's one of the more veteran people in the group, and he's learned this. So instead of jumping in, he took the time to say, what is it? What is it like for you?
Okay, so what I was hearing there is that with that story, that the people jumped in, they had coming from their own experience, and they hadn't taken the time to really hear and what this woman who's going through this divorce, what her real experience is. And they were making all kinds of assumptions. And instead of just waiting and really listening, asking open-ended questions and empathizing, feeling into her experience and getting to the truth of her experience, they were making all these assumptions and judgments, and it turned out to be a wholly different situation than really, and that they were using sympathy. They were going from their own experience versus really hearing and slowing down and taking the time to listen to her experience.
Yes, they were moving in quickly with sympathy and rather than learning, and they will learn because what they saw in the process is how off their perceptions were.
Mm-hmm.
So those, I can guarantee you that those two women, that woman and that man will learn to slow down as they go on in this group process, because it'll calm them as they become more accurate in their perceptions, and that's where the giving and receiving of empathy changes us, and it calms us, because they're getting so anxious because what's happening, they're remembering their past, and that's one of the key things in expressing empathy. Slow down, ask open-ended questions, learn from the past. You have to learn where your biases are. That's why I combine empathy with CBT, because CBT doesn't focus on the past. You have to learn, those two people were learning in a very important way where their biases are. They're too raw from their divorces, so they're jumping in.
Mm-hmm. So you're holding the space and doing the facilitation of the group, just in the way you hold the way these groups work, and then you're modeling the empathy and you're kind of slowing it down and you're facilitating a more empathic approach, and then people dialogue is this what I'm understanding, and then they're slowly learning how to kind of empathize, maybe from being modeled by you or others in the group who have more experience, and they learn sort of through that process. Is that, I don't know if I'm kind of getting that.
No, you are. Exactly, Edwin. That's part of the process, is that we're learning where our biases are. Not only about other people, but about ourselves. Someone comes in for instance, we have a fellow who he went to a state college, and he always was ashamed. He grew up in a blue-collar town. He went to a state college, and he always feels very embarrassed about it. And at one point, he was going to tell us what he was embarrassed about, and everybody looked, because we were waiting 3 weeks to find out what this big thing was. And you went to a state college, and that's what you were going to tell us? Really? And I mean, everybody said, "Boy, we're not laughing at you. We just can't believe that that's what you thought we would think negatively about you." Another fella is overweight, and he said, "I want to tell you, I understand the process here, but I know everybody is focusing on my weight when you look at me." And nine of the people said, "I'm not even thinking about your weight. We're really far more focused on what you've been saying, and you're very insightful." And he's like, "Oh, you're just saying that." I added a fella about 5 months ago, which was a fascinating thing. He came in, he has probably one of the most negative, stressful people I've ever met, because he always is, deflating himself. But he's very quick-witted and very jovial, and he came in and he was talking, and people were telling him how much they liked being with him, how much they liked him in the group. And he came in an individual session to me, and this is absolutely the truth, and he said to me, "I know what you did to me last week." I said, "What?" He goes, "You hired 9 actors to try to get me to be positive." He said, "Those people were acting." You see how embedded his conditioning was and how negative his self-voice is. He couldn't even believe it, that people actually found him to be enjoyable. But it was true. And he wasn't making it up. It wasn't a joke. He really thought these were actors. Like it was a play. Nobody could, immediately like me in an hour and a half. But they did. One of the things they liked about him, he's very honest. He tends to be too negative about himself, but he's very vulnerable. And what happened was, with his vulnerability, other people opened up more. And they felt actually more comfortable opening up. And for that, they gave him a lot of positive validation.
Well, that's another aspect of your book, is you have quite a few stories like this. Like you share like real stories of people who have gone through these groups or these processes, and how they've transformed through empathy. So I think, every chapter has at least one, seems to have at least 1 or 2 or more, I believe, of these stories. So that's like a big part of the book.
Well, I tried to make the book, Edwin, more of a workbook. So at the end of every chapter, I ask you which aspects of these stories you identify with, what cognitive distortions have you identified in your own relating, And then there's different questionnaires at the end. There's a stress questionnaire, there's a performance addiction questionnaire, there's an empathy questionnaire to give you a sense of where you are in those categories. And then I ask people to take them again at the end of the book. And every chapter at the end is a take action part, because I believe, you know, change is an active process, that you have to do something with it. We can't just talk about it, you have to put it into play. So I encourage people to read the book slowly, not fast. Slow down and digest it, and do some of the exercises. And in the take action at the end of every chapter, I ask you to share it with someone close to you. Because when we give and receive empathy, that's where the growth is, not just thinking about it to ourselves. We have to put it into action, and it's in the interpersonal realm. It's between you and I that the change occurs.
Well, this book really inspired me in that I do this freestyle dance that I used to. I haven't been doing it so much recently. But one of the, it's just, you know, freestyle, moving on the dance floor to the music. And at one of these dances, I felt an anxiety within myself. I could feel the visceral quality of anxiety in my body, and it was sort of like through the core of me, like and it's that, and it was like that deep, you know, cutting edge that you have with cortisol, right? So so I said that, you know, instead of going dancing, kind of avoiding it, I wanted to dance into the fear. I wanted to get as close as I could to the granular level of it. I wanted to see it as close as I could. And I started dancing, and I was moving, and I was kind of feeling into that fear and that anxiety, and getting closer. And I got into the kind of you know, I got close to it, and then it kind of turned into sort of a metaphors of, oh, this is like thousands of little knives, you know, and I want to get closer to that, and I got closer and closer. And by going into it, it's sort of like a veil disappeared, and just, it was gone. But then within about 5 or 10 seconds, I became aware of another anxiety. There was like a heavy, foggy weight on my head over me, and it was like a numbness in my brain. So I said, okay, there's another anxiety or fear, stress. I'm going to go into that. And I danced and moved into that, and the same thing happened. You know, I actually went through it, and then within another 5 or 10 seconds, it seemed like I became aware of another anxiety or another stress in my body, but in a different form, in a different visceral shape of feeling. And I went into that, and I kept doing this. And then there was like a woman that I would sometimes dance with, and then she would always, you know, after a while, kind of quickly kind of turn and move away. So I would always have this feeling of rejection, right? So even getting together with her, I would feel like already anticipate this rejection was going to come. But then I said, okay, I'm going to stick with it. I'm going to stay present with the feeling of rejection. I want to get as close as possible to that stress, you know, fear of rejection. You know, it's like a tightness in my throat, or, you know, whatever it is, getting closer to it, feeling my way into the experience. And then we ended up having this really great dance, like she's staying very present, you know, for like a 10-minute dance. And but I was constantly going into the fears and anxieties and the stresses. And at the end of this dance, after about an hour of dancing into stress, fear, anxiety, I felt so good. I mean, I felt so calm, so relaxed, so centered in my body. And usually, like after a dance, I've been in this physical dance mode, and then after the dance, people are kind of standing around, you know, talking, and I always have trouble engaging socially. I get kind of like social anxiety about engaging socially with people, you know, kind of talking at a kind of. But I didn't even try to engage. I just kind of was there, calm, relaxed, enjoying that kind of oxytocin sort of calmness. And then people were like drawn to me. They were like coming to me to be kind of almost like in my presence. And I was just calmly, I didn't feel anxious that I had to say something. I just would, you know, speak with a sense of presence and didn't feel like I had to, you know, kind of control or whatever the environment. So this was like one of these profound insights for me about the nature of stress, anxiety, fear, that it's so powerful to go into these feelings and transform them. And this was like a sort of a self-empathy, more of a self-empathy. And I even thought while I was doing it, I thought this would be so great to share and talk with others about this experience.
Yes.
And so I thought, this is so profound. I need to work more on this. And, you know, I haven't gone into it that much, but after reading your book, it like totally re-inspired me to go into this. So I want to thank you for this inspiration, because it's like you laid out in writing the whole arguments, the whole pros and cons and the process, and this whole into the experience that I had, you know. So I'm very kind of grateful for that. And it's kind of inspired me for a lot of different ideas I have now about kind of the next steps that I would like to do. And the empathy process that I use is what I call empathy circles. So, which this is like small groups, 4 people in a group, and we have empathic listening. So one person shares, and then one person, you speak to someone, and that person reflects back your understanding of what you say until you feel fully heard. And then it's that person's turn to speak, and we go around and, you know, for about 2 hours. And I've been thinking of holding these circles, but with the theme of share a stress, anxiety, or fear that you're holding in the moment, and then sort of get this empathy for it and this empathy bath. So I'm kind of like wondering, what do you think about all this, or how does this kind of land, you know, for you?
I think your experience is profound, because I mean, I feel like you just took me through the whole book. Let me see let me give a little conceptualization from my point of view of what you were saying. One is, you begin to feel some self-consciousness, and so you were beginning to release some cortisol. And then there was a little bit of a cognitive is that she's going to reject you. And we don't know that that was happening at all, but you began to think that might happen. So that could have really produced more cortisol, and you could have just walked off the dance floor and stopped. And then it would have been encoded in your brain. You see, people reject me. Even though it wasn't true, you would have taken that cognitive distortion and made it real, because the brain doesn't differentiate between what we think and what's actually happening. So, okay, you would have sat, but you didn't do that. You stayed with it. And almost in a Buddhist sense, you went with it, and you went into the fear rather than avoiding it and running away from it. And then you played with reality a little bit. You saw her, and you didn't stay with the idea that she's rejecting you, and that eventually you were letting the cortisol run through your system, and you were trying to get a hold of yourself because you kept moving, you kept dancing. You were saying, in a sense, I'm not going to give in to stress. I'm not going to let it overcome me. If your voice was negative, and you could say, oh my God, all these people looking at me, I'm making such a fool of myself, I better sit down, you probably would start to perspire, and you might keep dancing, but it would be a horrible experience. What happened was you identified something, maybe even unconsciously, that you didn't go with, she's rejecting you. If you embellish that, it would have produced more and more cortisol, and your movements even would have been restricted. But somehow you work through it, you stay with it, you don't go with the cognitive distortion, you don't let the negative thinking live in you, you don't let it own you, and you become a little bit more relaxed. And as you're becoming more relaxed, you're changing the chemical makeup. We're going from cortisol to oxytocin. You're tipping the scale a little bit. And as you're tipping the scale, people are coming in your world. And as people are coming in your world, your brain is saying, oh, I'm not rejected. They're actually attracted to me. They actually want to be in my presence and in my space. And now the cortisol is really at bay. I mean, it's an excellent example of the whole paradigm. And your idea in group, Edwin, I think that's a wonderful idea, because you're saying, conjure up the stressful situation. Okay, And now I say, oh, I was stressed at the supermarket today when the cashier, I could tell the way she looked at me, she was rude, and there was something about me she didn't like. Maybe I shouldn't have been in the store in a bathing suit. Incidentally, I'm dressed the way I am because I'm on vacation. But, you know, just so I go into the store, let's say, and the woman looks at me, and I probably should have had a shirt on. And now I start to experience this. I could go with that, right? And I could make it my own. And then I could have resentment toward the person rather than saying, did she really care that I have a tank top on and a bathing suit, or was she just, you know, had a headache or in a bad mood or overworked or whatever? It's that opening up the door to other possibilities rather than going with the old record. Say your old record was, I'm going to be rejected by people when I dance. You could have really embellished that, but you didn't embellish it. You waited to see if it was a reality, and it turns out it wasn't a reality. And your brain now knows that. That's the record you paved. That's the new pathway in your brain. You know, you created a new memory. And if you do that in a group, so now I talk about this stressful situation in the supermarket, and you say to me, yeah, but what was it based on? How do you know she didn't like what your attire was? Now we start to examine it factually, just like the group experiences I was talking about earlier. And I come to see, through your help and a couple other people's help, that I really don't know what that cashier felt toward me. So now I'm reducing the cortisol release and the memory, because cortisol binds memory. That's another important piece here. When we release cortisol, it binds memory in the emotional center of the brain, and it makes it seem like it's real. So we have to open it up and unleash it. And through your help in a group exercise like that, I tell you, and now covering the reality of the experience. Here's how I recorded it, but here's how my friends in this group see it. They don't believe that I should have come to that conclusion at all, because they don't see how I could determine that that woman didn't like what my attire was. I mean, that would be an excellent experience for people, especially if they're really recalling something that really stressed them, because once we recall it, you start to feel it again, right?
Right.
And I'm giving a trite example, a woman in a grocery store versus my beach attire, but say it was more serious than that, and it really hurt the person. And now, you know, you're going over it in a group setting. Let's tease out through empathic listening what the facts are, what the truth is. You're rearranging you're helping someone rearrange their brain toward objectivity and truth, rather than living with distorted reality.
Well, there seems to be another part of the sharing of stress. That if I share my stress and my anxiety, like you have the stress or anxiety of wearing a tank top at the grocery store, or being judged, and if you share that and then you get a reflection from someone else, that they can accurately share their understanding of what it is that your experience was, there's something about, it's almost like a releasing. It's like the stress is in our body. It's a felt visceral feeling. And it's like, how do we bring it out and sort of like release it? And it seems that somehow that listening, that empathy from someone else opens up and sort of releases the feeling out into, I don't know, into space. And that's,
yes.
So it's a little bit, it's not so much like in the empathy circles that I'm talking about. It's not so much about someone giving, you know, comments. It's really a focus on someone sort of accurately sharing being present with you in this stress, and then accurately sharing, reflecting their understanding. And so that shared accompaniment, one, empathic presence and accompaniment, and being able to open that feeling and sort of letting it you know, flow out into the world.
Yes. And I think that way of listening is the key. For instance, if you know, someone had said that story about me in the grocery store, if I said, oh, for crying out loud, Edwin, you're being ridiculous. The woman didn't even know you. Let's stop obsessing. Okay, now that's shutting it down.
Exactly.
Rather
yeah.
than, how we unleash the biases is, gee, Edwin, how did you come to determine that she didn't like you because of your clothing?
Yeah, I just saw the way she was looking at me, and she seemed to be sort of frowning, and I could just feel that kind of come right into me. I could feel myself clenching up when I saw that frowning that she was doing.
And then I would say, is that a familiar feeling? Is that familiar to you? When people, you start to get into where the past comes in.
Mm-hmm. So you kind of you find that experience, and you look for past experiences and go into those past experiences that resonate with that.
Exactly.
Okay. Because
you're trying to uncover, not only, if I just dismiss it and say, oh, you're being ridiculous, why are you thinking that way? That's ridiculous. That doesn't help anybody. How about uncovering where the bias comes from? Because if you look at me and I'm frowning and you think I'm angry or I don't like you, that's coming from somewhere. Most of the time it comes from history. That's where the empathy comes in. So if I'm able to relate to you with empathy and I say, where do you think that emerged? Because she frowned, but you don't really know her. Well, my mother was always frowning. Let's just give an exaggerated example. Well, my mother was always unhappy, especially with the way I dressed. I always wasn't this. I didn't have lipstick on it. Whatever it may be, there's a story there. We need to locate the story. And then we can examine the reality of the story. And that's what empathy does. Instead of shutting it down, it opens it up. And we learn from the past. And when we learn from the past, we can change the way we perceive. We change the way we perceive, we don't have as much stress. We don't have as much cortisol. We can connect better. You might even ask here, gee, you're frowning. Do you have a headache? Are you okay? And maybe you even get an answer. You ask an open-ended question. Are you okay? You seem like you're disturbed by something. Or, oh, no, well, my son left for the Army this morning. You get some answers instead of reading in. See, that's the quick read in. The read in is almost always history and a lack of empathy. It's the quick distortion. You looked at me a certain way, that means that. You come from the South, that means something. You come from the West, that you're Irish, you're Italian, you're Muslim, whatever it is. It's the reading in very quickly based on history. Then we have to examine, is the history accurate or is it inaccurate? And that's what a group situation can do. And that's what giving and receiving empathy is all about. It's slowing it down enough to find out, is the perception distorted? The cashier really wasn't. We don't know what she was. All we know is that I drove home for half an hour thinking that this woman didn't like me. And so she rented space in my head for half an hour based on almost nothing. So what is it based on? It's based on something behind me, not what's in front of me. And once you learn that, you keep identifying these biases and you keep shedding them and shedding them and shedding them. And then you're much calmer because you're not reading in all the time.
So within a group then you get the immediate empathy for the situation, like with what happened in the store. So that has a calming effect. But then in the group, you're actually tracking that story back to the origin and then kind of opening that up and transforming that. So whatever stress is in the present, you work it back to maybe a deeper cause and kind of unravel that through empathy as well. So kind of like a layers of sort of a layer approach I could see.
Yes.
Oh, great. Well, so go ahead.
I just a quick example. We were driving to the gym, my son-in-law and my son-in-law-to-be the other day, and there was a car that was parked a little bit, you have these lines you're supposed to park within, and there was a car parked a little bit in between both spaces, so it took up an extra space. And my son-in-law quickly said, oh, what an arrogant guy who would do that. And I said, how do you know he's arrogant? How do you know it was a he? He goes, oh, there you go again. We're going to examine this. And he was kidding me, of course. And my future son-in-law-to-be said from the blind, she goes, well, how do you know that he doesn't have a problem seeing? How do you know that he has some eye difficulty? And he was going on and on. So we were going on and on with all these 100 other possibilities. How do you know his wife isn't pregnant? He had to run into the hospital. How do you know? But the quick reaction is how arrogant that guy is that he parked like that. I had an example, a wonderful example, that a patient of mine went on a cruise, and he's a very quick reactor. And when you're on these cruises, they take all these pictures. And in the evening meal, you can look at all the photographs, and if you want some, you can buy them from the photographer. So my client is standing in front looking at all these pictures of people on the cruise, and this woman walks right in front of him and starts looking at the pictures. And he puts his hand on her shoulder. He says, "Hey, who do you think you are? You walked right in front of me." She goes, "Oh, I'm so sorry," and she walked away. And he was angry, and he was telling his wife about it at dinner. The next day, she came to breakfast, and she tapped him on the shoulder, and she said, "I want to apologize. I had just got news that, and I have breast cancer. I'm a breast cancer survivor, but I just got news that my second mammogram they have found something. And I was so anxious, I just wasn't thinking. I wasn't even looking at the pictures." Now, he assumed that she was being arrogant and self-absorbed and just walked right in front of him. What happened was she was preoccupied because she just found out of the potential for a reoccurrence of cancer. It's all of those kind of quick reading in. Like somebody cuts you off in traffic and you assume they're this, that, and the other thing. Well, how do we know they're not trying to get to the ER? How do we know they didn't just get fired? How do we know they just didn't come from divorce court? How do we know they just didn't find out one of their children is in the ER? We don't know. You know, one of the key phrases of empathy is, "I don't know. I don't know. I don't have the facts." Because it actually calms you when you can say, "I don't know. I don't know why that person is reacting that way. I don't have the answers. I don't have the facts yet. I'm going to try to gain the facts, but I don't have the facts." The distortions are all wrapped up in thinking we know the facts from our history. So I look at you and I know what you're all about because you're from California and you're interested in empathy, and you look at me and you say, "Oh, he's a guy from Boston. He's got an Italian last name. He must be in the mafia," you know, on and on and on, right? And we actually know very little. But our minds can't help that. I did an experiment once years ago in a hospital where I had a one-way mirror and had people on the other side of the mirror, and I had 10 people on the other side and 10 people on this side. And I asked the 10 people on this side, "Tell me what those people are all about." "Oh, for crying out loud," they said, "we can't tell them. We can't even hear them. All they're doing is sitting and talking." I said, "No, tell me what they're about." After about 10 minutes, people started to talk. "Oh, that one's a doctor. I bet that guy's an arrogant attorney. This one's, oh, she's probably a school teacher and passive." And people were writing books about these people just from looking across at faces. And what I was trying to do by that experiment is showing we all have the biases. And by people just talking freely, it was revealing all of them. And the majority of what was being said was incorrect because I knew the people on the other side.
Well, this is
our brain.
Sorry. Go ahead.
Our brains have all these memories.
I mean, this book, I think this really gets to like a core issue, a core process, a core dynamics. This whole, it's sort of like fear versus empathy, you know, cortisol versus oxytocin. This is like a core dynamics that it comes through it's sort of these personal levels, but I think it also scales up to our national level. You're talking about, you know, we have the policing, the Black Lives Matter issues of prejudice, and the fear of politics of fear. And so I think this is totally scalable to what's going on at a national level, where, you know, we have all these different groups that are not listening to each other, and that really the solution from this personal level, or even if I think in this national level, is going to be to bring people together, to dialogue with each other, to really empathize deeply with each other. And so I just see it as very really a core dynamic that you've articulated. And I think, and it's been an inspiration to me as I was telling my story. So it's totally re-inspired me to take on some of these, you know, go and continue going in this direction. So I want to thank you for that. We've gone a little bit over an hour here, so we should bring this. I could keep talking to you on and on. Maybe we'll do another dialogue in the future too. Because
I hope I can. I would love to talk to you again. You're very interesting to interact with. You ask great questions. I would love to talk again, if possible.
Okay, well, great. Well, thank you for this dialogue, and to be continued.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.